In this chapter, we will learn to summarize the pathway of evolution from single-cell organisms to humans, and we will also discuss the field of evolutionary psychology and the study of mate bonding. Before we go into the specifics of nature or nurture, we'll be addressing the man whose picture appears in your lower right-hand side. Michael Mejia, a 26-year-old identified and documented gang member, is responsible for killing a Whittier officer, Keith Boyer, in February of 2017. According to police records, Officer Keith Boyer and his partner were responding to a traffic accident in Whittier's Friendly Hills neighborhood on a Monday morning. Authorities said that Mejia was involved in a car crash near the area, and when the two officers approached Mejia, he tried to search him for weapons. Mejia opened fire with a semi-automatic handguns. At least one officer returned fire and struck him, but unfortunately Officer Boyer, a 53-year-old father and full-time member of the force since 1990, was pronounced dead. As someone whose brother is a police officer, news like these often bring about an emotion and a sense of indignation to see how someone's innocent life could be taken by someone who doesn't seem to have any scruples. According to investigators, Mejia, a documented street gang member from Los Angeles, had a criminal record that included charges of vandalism and resisting arrest, and had previously been convicted of a robbery, grand theft auto, and a vehicle theft. He had been released from Pelican Bay State Prison on April of 2016 and reported to the probation department the following day. Interestingly, as if this was not enough, Mejia was eventually found also guilty of having killed his cousin that same morning when he killed Officer Boyer. Mejia was released on parole under post-release community supervision as required by Assembly Bill 109, which was a bill signed by Governor Jerry Brown. This bill moved certain felony offenders from state prisons to county jails, and authorities said that he was released approximately 10 days before the individual did the killing. People who were affected by this claimed that this killing wouldn't have happened had Michael Mejia not been released earlier from his prison sentence. However, it is important to look at Mejia's rap sheet and wonder if a few more days in prison would have in fact changed this man. Based on this story, I'd like us to look at the many factors that have an impact on behavior other than genetics or learning. I apologize for blocking the wording that appears to be under Michael Mejia's picture, but what you see right here where I'm pointing to basically is a description of the illustration here of how many biopsychologists think about the biology of behavior. So we'll start off by looking at evolution. When we look at evolution, we find that this influences the pool of behavior influencing genes that are available to the members of each species. And the primary purpose of evolution is to pass on our genes, which would then be passed down to here. However, our genes begin to intermingle with the experiences we have. So let's look at Michael Mejia. He actually has a father who was also a documented gang member, who was also involved in gang activities, and who also has an interesting rap sheet. But as we look at the genes, could we claim that it was only the genes that were passed along? Well, we cannot negate that that may have an influence, but we also have to look at the environment in which they were both raised. So when we combine the genes and we combine the experience, you could see this interaction, which would give way to the current organism. Current organism would then be Michael Mejia, who received the genes from his parents and who was exposed to the experiences that were probably not so pleasant. And then this current organism begins to be engaged with this current situation. What current situations? Perhaps his desire to survive, perhaps his desire to fit in the community, perhaps his anger toward whatever conditions he may have been exposed to, then give way to a specific behavior, which unfortunately, if this is not stopped before he has children, would then be passed along through evolution to then have another child that would be exposed to very similar experiences, and then that child, which would be the organism, would then get involved with situations that would be similar, and then we'd have that current behavior passed along, and sadly, we would see this repetition for many generations. Please note that I'm not condoning this behavior. This is something that affects us all in society, but we're simply trying to understand that it is not just genetics that made this individual do what he do. It is a combination of genes and experience. And to the claim that had he spent 15 more days in jail, he would have not killed this man, it is a valid claim, as possibly it would have been another officer or another person, but this man's rap sheet and the killing of his cousin to take his car and the killing of the officer without any remorse indicate that perhaps a few more days wouldn't have made a difference. His genes and his experiences were basically ingrained into what this current individual in this organism with the current situation was going to engage in. As stated in your book by the author, the asking whether this behavior is a byproduct of nature or nurture, or determining how much was determined by nature and how much was determined by nature, is almost as asking whether a concert or a song came from the instrument or from the musician. And if not one or the other, then how much of it came from the instrument and how much of it came from the musician. Please note that genetic and experiential factors do not simply combine in an additive fashion. We believe that behavioral capacities are created through a combination of various parts of genetics and various parts of experience, rather than just through a simple interaction of genetics and experiences. I hope this demonstrates the inadequacy in thinking about biology of behavior in terms of dichotomies. Per the previous slide, human evolution has helped us understand human behavior. While Darwin was not the first to propose that species evolve, he was the first to compile supporting evidence and to suggest also how evolution works. The first 3 points that you see on this slide are 3 kinds of evidence that were presented by Darwin. Darwin argued that the evolution occurred through natural selection. Darwin's evidence is, as you can see in here, based on fossil evidence of evolution that we'll describe in a bit. Structural similarities among living species suggested among ancestors, and the impact of selective breeding. The 4th point is an observation that was made by evolutionary biologist Dr. Peter Grant in 1991 as he went on a trip to the Galapagos Islands, and this observation of a dramatic change after a single season of drought on the finches of the beaks of these finches significantly supported Darwin's work. To illustrate further on the previous 4 points, we look at the 4 kinds of evidence in here. The first one being the fossil evidence of evolution. As you can see on on the top slide here, fossil records have been shown to change systematically through geological layers. And this is illustrated here as you can see the evolution of the hominid skull. Here you can see that the shape of it seems to be a little bit more elongated with the jaw sticking out further out. And as we come closer to the more shallow layers of our Earth, of our surface, we start seeing that the fossils found are not as similar. There are some striking similarities, but yet there are also pivotal differences. You can see that the face was a bit more flat, and this is consistent with humans' skull today. Again, the deeper layers, the deeper geological layers would demonstrate the more elongated jaw that you see here. The second supporting evidence we have here is the structural similarities among living species, suggesting some common ancestors. You can see in here the wing of a bat in comparison to that of the arm of a human. And you can see the color similarities here of a wing bat, and you can see the color similarities in a human, and this suggests that there are similarities among diverse living species that can in fact present some form of evidence that we may in fact be related in different ways with other species. You can see in here that the tip of the wing over here would represent the tip of our fingers, and you could see here that some parts of the fingers and knuckles would be in this part of the wing, and again this forearm bone here would be the equivalent of this in the wing, and also our bicep, or the top part of our arm, would be this part of the wing. Therefore, again, supporting the idea. Please note that this evidence is support. It doesn't necessarily prove anything. As you must already know, the only people that prove things are mathematicians. Scientists, psychologists, biologists, we support theories. The third kind of evidence supporting the theory that species evolve is the impact of selective breeding on domestic plants and animals. And this seems to be based on dogs. And sadly, some of these major changes that have been created in domestic plants and animals are based on selective breeding. And the reason why I say sad is because some animals have been bred in ways that make them more fitting and more likely to win contests in which they meet a particular criteria of beauty or aesthetics, but it leaves them oftentimes with difficulties even to breathe, such as the case is with a bulldog. As you may be familiar with bulldogs, bulldogs are known to have a flat face, and this sometimes could create a lot of problems when trying to breathe. Many of them sometimes have to go through surgeries, multiple surgeries, to be able to fix a deviated septum, and we believe that this was a result of a major change based on programs of selective breeding, as having a face that's a little bit more flat would increase the chances of the dog being able to attack well, as it would have made it possible that they could get closer to the prey, to whatever it is they're attacking, without being hit in the face and having the dog turn away. And just like that, we continue seeing these things in here. We can also see that we could create some domestic plants and modify things based on our preference. And so we see that a lot with food, even without GMOs, or genetically modified food, excuse me. The fourth and most convincing evidence comes from direct observation and evolution in progress. And this, as stated earlier, was not an evidence provided by Darwin. This, in fact, was provided in 1991 by evolutionary biologist Peter Grant. After visiting on a trip to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there was a drastic change just over a single season of drought in here. And you can see here the finch, the beak of the finch in here, and you can see the difference right here. This is believed to be the result of just, again, one single season of drought, whereas if there is enough rainfall, then there is more likely to be food available for these birds at the surface of the earth. However, if there is a drought, then the earth is not as moist, and sometimes the worms and others dig in deeper where there's a little bit more moist. And so in order to survive, these finches have to dig in deeper, and going a little bit deeper and having a beak that was not as long would have not increased their survival. So by then evolving and changing into a longer beak in a single season of drought, they would have been able to remain alive, pass on their genes, and now their genes would have impacted their offspring, which would have been born with similar beaks. Another example of evolution in progress comes from the black versus peppered moths. Um, Basically, the survival rate before and after the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s was changed. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the trees were a little bit more gray, which allowed for peppered moths to camouflage, and therefore they would not be eaten by other animals. However, after the Industrial Revolution, because of the smog and the contamination, many trees were darkened, and because of the change in the tree, the peppered moths would no longer camouflage. Now it was the black moths that would then camouflage, and we saw a significant change in survival rate between black and peppered moths, whereas the peppered moths had a higher survival rate before the Industrial Revolution when the trees were not darkened, and the black moths did not. We saw that change after the trees were darkened, and this is yet another example of evolution in progress. As you have seen, evolution brings about a lot of physical changes. However, the changes are not only physical. Sometimes behaviors also change. And just as physical features can contribute to fitness, so do behaviors. Some of these features are very obvious, and that basically is the ability to find food, avoid predation. These would allow an individual to be more likely to pass on their genes. However, some are not as obvious. For example, social dominance. What we find in here is that the dominant male usually wins encounters with all other males of the group. The number 2 male usually wins encounters with all male except the dominant male. And so on down the line. We find that low-ranking males fight little, and the lower levels of the hierarchy tend to be only vaguely recognizable. In some species, the dominant copulate more than non-dominant males, which would lead to being more effective in passing on their characteristics to future generations. And so we see that example on page 27 with elephant seals. As simplistic as some of these animals may be, many of these species engage in intricate series of courtship attempts and displays prior to copulating with the females. Oftentimes, males make use of one or more sensory modalities to signal and receive responses from females. And these are, again, behaviors that would have been learned, but also inherited from their ancestors. As we learned a couple of slides back on evidence for evolution, the second point suggests that structural similarities among living species may be because of common ancestry. However, similarities in structures of the body don't necessarily mean common ancestry. With homologous structures, basically indicates that similar structures are due to a common evolutionary origin. For example, bird wings and human arms may suggest that we may come from a similar ancestry point. However, analogous structures, though they're similar structures, they don't necessarily have a common origin. And so we look at the example of bird wings versus bee wings. In this case, while they both may serve a purpose, which is to fly, we believe that this similarity does not come from a shared ancestry point. Instead, We believe the similarities are the result of what we call convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is defined as the evolution in unrelated species of similar solutions to the same environmental demands. For example, if food is scarce and buried deep under the ground, then there is an environmental demand which will make species of different origins develop longer beaks and longer arms, or thinner fingers, or longer tongues. However, if there's also a predatory issue, such as being eaten by a larger animal, then what would increase survival would be your ability to develop wings to fly. And this would be regardless of whether we have a common ancestry. It would simply be a demand based on the environment. Just as our physical traits and our behaviors evolve, so does our brain. In the past, Sir Francis Galton, cousin to the late Charles Darwin, believed that there was a relationship between brain size and intelligence. The argument made was that if you had a bigger head, you must have a bigger brain, and the bigger the head, the more intelligent you were. We now know that there is no relationship between brain size and intelligence. Instead, what we know is that brain size is generally correlated with body size, as we can see that an elephant has a much larger brain than humans, and so does a whale. However, although kind of self-righteous and somewhat arrogantly, we as humans believe we have the most amazing brain and the highest level of intelligence. Of course, that's a bit biased, but there's research that actually does support this argument. It's also known that research has focused a lot more on the relative size of different brain regions. For example, looking at the brain stem, which regulates reflex activities that are critical for survival, would have been more of interest when investigating the brain of primates and of reptiles and of other pets that would not have the higher executive functions that we as humans do. Looking at the cerebrum, which is also known as the cerebral hemisphere, would basically be looking at this wrinkled, elegant part of the brain in here. And this would have been researched when investigating complex activities. For example, looking at the perception rather than just sensation, or looking at motivation, or looking at emotions and learning, and looking at a commitment to one person. Now, all these right here, which seem to be more complex, higher executive functions, would have been devoted to this part of the brain here. Whereas the brainstem would be what is also known as the old brain or reptilian brain, or the central core. And this would be a little bit more of interest for us when researching vital functions. Per the evolutionary theory, we find that humans are the byproduct or the offspring of organisms and species that have been around much longer than humans have. Going all the way back down to the fish, you can see that the cerebral cortex, which would be the yellow part in here, is significantly smaller than that of a human. Well, that's an obvious statement in here, but when we look at the central core, or the old brain, the brain stem, we find that that is larger than the cerebral cortex. Different than what we see here with humans, whereas we have a larger cerebral cortex and what appears to be a smaller brain stem. What does this mean in terms of behavior? Well, when we look at fish, while they're capable of surviving for the most part, we see that they're not capable of thinking in a very sophisticated fashion. In fact, many of them are quite easily caught, and there have been many ways in which humans have outsmarted fish when it comes down to catching them for eating. As we look at an animal that's been around a little bit less time on Earth than the fish, we'll look at the rat or the mouse in here, and you can see that there is an increase in size from the fish's cerebral cortex to the rat's cerebral cortex. We understand that, rats are caught also by humans, they have also outsmarted humans in their attempts to extinguish them. If you don't believe that, and if you've been to New York, you know that this is not an unusual entertainment or animal to be found in the streets of New York. Rats and mice are actually quite intelligent. They're able to learn complex mazes in a short period of time, and they are able to adjust to different environments. We also see the cat's brain in here. You can see that this appears to be larger cerebral cortex, and we also can look at the amazing tricks that cats can do. They're able to discriminate on different foods, and they know when someone is going to feed them and when someone may hurt them. And while they do make mistakes, we also see that their thinking seems to be a lot more sophisticated than that of the other two animals that we've talked about. And then we look at the chimp here. And the chimp has an amazing brain with a tremendous capacity, their ability to communicate with sign language, and very similar behaviors to what humans do. And again, we attribute this to the evolution of the cerebral cortex. And finally, we get to the human brain, which has the impressive cerebral cortex in here that's allowed us to communicate in a written language and a spoken language, and also has allowed us to make some decisions, some good that would allow us as humanity to move on to a better stage of our life with a better climate, and some decisions that have not been so good, but nonetheless the thinking process and the ability to generate such ideas as we discussed earlier, such as the seven wonders of the world, or create airplanes, or do things that are amazing, have actually come from the amazing, sophisticated cerebral cortex. Please note that the brainstem, the central core of the old brain, contributes to our survival, as it is responsible for maintaining some vital signs, our ability to breathe, our ability to secrete hormones, and all that also has to do with the brainstem. But please note that the higher executive functions, the decisions, are controlled by the cerebrum, also known as cerebral cortex. As stated earlier, the human brain has increased in size during evolution, whereas healthy human brains vary greatly in size between 1 to 2 kilograms. We see that they rank significantly behind whales and elephants in brain size, which are 5 kilograms and 8 kilograms respectively. However, we believe that the larger animals have more brain tissue because larger bodies require more brain tissue to control and regulate them. To move my arm, which is not so large, I don't require that many neurons or that much brain tissue to move that arm. But if I have an elephant trunk, if I have elephant limbs, which are much heavier, I would need a lot more neurons and a lot more brain tissue devoted to it. We also find that most of the increase in size has occurred in the cerebrum, as you saw in the previous slide. The yellow part, the cerebral cortex, has actually been the most augmented when we've looked at evolution. And we find that the way it has continued growing has been through these increased convolutions. Now, convolutions are basically characterized by twists, turns, spirals, etc., something that is difficult to follow or trace. And so we find that these are the convolutions in here. And we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail later. But this right here, we believe, allows us to increase the volume of the cerebral cortex without increasing the size. If we did not have these convolutions, our brain would be smooth, but our head would be much larger than what it is. As we look at evolution, we also can see that as the species evolve, so do their mate bonding skills or practices. As we look at most species, we find that the majority mate in a promiscuous fashion, meaning that they are going around with multiple partners, and this typically is sometimes even without remorse. Well, that is seen in most species. We find that it is a characteristic that does not seem to change as we mature or by experience. as animals, dogs, cats, rats. They may mate in promiscuous ways. However, as we start looking specifically at mammals, we find that they form polygynous mating bonds. And polygynous basically comes from polygyny of having multiple wives. And so we would see the male having several offspring with different female partners. As we look into the more evolved component, we look at humans and the form of mammals, generally form monogamous bonds. And when we talk about monogamy, we're talking about a mate bonding pattern in which the enduring bonds are formed between one male and one female. However, we ask the question, does monogamy persist in all cultures? And we find that the answer is no. Monogamy is mostly promoted among Western cultures, but it is not the case. This begs to ask the question whether monogamy is a byproduct of nature, meaning did we inherit it from our parents, or if it's a byproduct of nurture, did we learn it? We believe that monogamy may be adaptive in allowing more attention to survival of children, which would be a characteristic of the evolutionary perspective, as the number one goal of the evolutionary process is to pass on our genes. However, we also see that the environment seems to have benefited or benefits still individuals who live in monogamous fashion. Looking at how an individual may have several children with multiple wives, whereas the law does not do anything to protect those children by making this individual pay child support, the individual may just continue having children everywhere he goes. But if there's a system in place that says, listen, for every child you have, you'll be responsible with a certain percentage of your pay, and this individual has many children scattered throughout, we would find that this would perhaps inhibit such behavior, whereas the individual would see it a lot more beneficial to stick to one partner, and in addition to that also increase the chances of their children surviving, as resources would be facilitated easier. Again, the evolutionary psychology of mate bonding, supporting the diagram that we saw earlier at the beginning of this slide, where we see evolution passing down the genes, but the genes interacting with the experience, which the genes with experience would give way to a current organism, which the current organism intertwined with current situation would then give way to a current behavior that would then be passed along to evolution. Current aspects of mate bonding in humans appear to be predicted by the evolutionary perspective. For example, we find that men tend to value youth and attractiveness as they associate these with health, and with a healthy partner, we would increase the chances of having healthy offspring. Women, however, tend to value power and earning capacity, whereas they would see, especially in previous ages where women were not allowed to work, if they were not allowed to work but they had a man who could provide, then they would increase the chances of feeding their children and increasing their survival rate. So women tend to value protection and earning capacity. Although some researchers believe that because of women's independence today, that may not be as evident or as true today. We find that also physical attractiveness predicts which women bond with men of high status. And you may see men who are in positions of power that sometimes they have access to female partners, romantic female partners, that we wonder if they would ever marry them if they did not have money, or if they would ever have them as romantic partners if they did not have the power. And so we find that, again, with physical attractiveness predicts which women would bond with men of high status. And the mate attraction strategies for women appears to be physical attraction, whereas for men, displaying power and resources. Before, gorillas used to beat their chest and break branches and make a lot of noise so that they could impress the females, and the females could see that they were good mates, good partners. Um, Today, we do not see men beating our chest per se, but we do see behaviors that may be similar to that. Not unusual sometimes to see a male playing very loud music in his car, trying to get the attention of people, and perhaps more specifically of females. We see men perhaps having the big toys, the big trucks, the big rims, the latest, because that would entail that the individual has power and resources, which, according to the evolutionary perspective, would make him more attractive. And also, we find that men are more likely than women to commit adultery. This has been historically supported, although it doesn't mean that women are not capable of. We just simply see that, for the most part, there are different reasons as to why men commit adultery and why women commit adultery. Well, this is, of course, a debatable topic like almost everything else. We find that men tend to commit adultery more so for visual purposes and just sexual gratification, whereas women who commit adultery, especially when in a committed relationship, they do it more so because of some form of neglect. And so the behaviors seem to change.